We are now at the end of 2022, the first full year of me doing the Survivor Gumball channel, and it was a pretty busy year. I mean, in this year, we covered 4 seasons of Survivor, those being Australian Survivor, Blood vs. Water, Survivor 42, Survivor SA, Return of the Outcasts, and Survivor 43. And as a way of looking back at this year in Survivor, I decided to create some awards to hand out based on what we saw from this year. Now, yes, there were some other shows I covered as well. There were 3 seasons of Big Brother, 2 seasons of The Amazing Race, and 1 season of The Circle. However, to keep this video concise, I'm just going to stick with Survivor. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the awards. So the first award I want to give out is for Best Tribe, and there were a couple of contenders that I had in mind. But I think for me, the best tribe has to go to Yontao, the pre-merge tribe from SA Return of the Outcast, simply based on the premise of this being a pre-merge tribe and it being full of people that we would normally not see on a returnee season. So I think based on that alone, it is pretty awesome. And for that reason, Yontao gets the best tribe award. Now, on the flip side, I did decide to give out a Worst Tribe award as well. And admittedly, there weren't any contenders I felt that great about. There weren't any tribes that I outright disliked, but really, I think this award goes to Ika from Survivor 42, as it really is the least remarkable tribe in my view. I feel like the people that were on it weren't that interesting from my perspective, and there weren't really any big characters that I was rooting for. So with that, Ika got the Worst Tribe award. Next, I wanted to give out a Favorite Character award, and there were a number of contenders for this one. I mean, obviously, there were some pretty big characters from each of these seasons. I mean, from Australian Survivor, you have Jordy, for example, or I guess Mark and Sam. They were pretty notable characters from that season. From SA, you had obviously Phil, and to a degree, Dino as well. And then from Survivor 42, you even have people like an Omer, and from 43, you have Cody, for example. But I'm actually going to go with the character that I related to the most, and I decided to give this award to Daniel Strunk from Survivor 42, simply because he was the character that I related to the most. And I feel like if I were to actually play Survivor, he's probably the character that I would end up the most liked. I feel like before 42, the character I would have said would probably be Jacob Derwin, but now that we've seen someone who had a similar trajectory to someone like Jacob Derwin, but have a bit more success throughout it, I did decide to give the award to Daniel here. Next up, I want to give an award for my favorite moment, and admittedly, there weren't that many contenders for this one. I mean, I did consider the Jenny Tribal from 42 simply due to how chaotic it was, but really, I feel like there's only one moment that can win this award for me, and that's the Cody Blindside from 43. Just everything about it, from the way Jesse got to play the idol on Owen, to then Carla flushing her own idol, which makes it a bit of a good move on Jesse's end. And then just seeing the reactions from everyone, like Cody feeling betrayed, and then Jesse doing his best to smooth things over by getting up to shake Cody's hand and just basically forcing Cody on the spot to be a good sport about it and to be like, good game, brother, even though Cody was deeply upset by it. It's really just a fun moment, both from a gameplay perspective, but also from an entertainment perspective. So to that end, I did decide to give this award to the Cody Blindside. Next up, I want to give out an award for the best move of the year, and there were a couple contenders for me. I mean, from Australian Survivor, there was the Jesse Blindside. From SA, you have the Steffi Blindside, but I think the one I decided to go with was the Omer Blindside from Survivor 42, simply because it's single-handedly the move that won Marianne the game. It's the move that she could point to the most in terms of her saying that she could claim credit for it. And yes, while she wasn't the only one that was involved with it, I feel like the fact that Marianne was able to take credit for it in her endgame really props it up to me. And plus, it was a pretty big moment as well, such as taking out the biggest player in the season, also someone with an idol nullifier. For me, that made it enough to make it the best move of the season. Next, on the other hand, there's the worst move of the season. And for me, there was one contender for this award, and it's also from Survivor 42, but it's Daniel blowing up his game during the Jenny Tribal. And for me, this was a massive comedy of errors, where Daniel was in such a great position early on in the game on his Vati tribe, as he and Chanel were essentially riding the middle coming to this vote, as both the duos from that group, Mike and Jenny, along with Hai and Lydia, thought that they were going to side with them. But then we have Chanel going to Shipwheel Island and losing her vote because of that, and that coupled with Mike losing his vote from the Beware advantage caused there to be a 2-2 tie going into it, with Daniel siding with the Mike and Jenny side to target Lydia. But then when they tie again on the revote, the vote becomes deadlocked, and essentially it's Daniel and Hai having to go into deliberation. And Daniel decides right out the bat to say that he does not want to go to Rocks, even though Hai was on the other side trying to get out Jenny. So by doing this, Daniel essentially hands all the leverage in the deliberation over to Hai, who wants to take out Jenny, like against what Daniel had voted for initially. And basically, Daniel just spews all sorts of crap during this whole section where he basically throws everyone under the bus. He throws Chanel under the bus. He ultimately flips over to Hai to take out Jenny. And because he had already voted against Lydia during the first two votes, he essentially alienates them as well. So he basically blows up his entire spot, going from the best positioned on the tribe to the worst positioned and the next consensus target at the next tribal that they go to. So it really was a massive comedy of errors, and while yes, it was triggered due to a really weird set of circumstances, the way Daniel handles this could not have gone any worse. But again, it's part of why I like Daniel so much. But with him blowing up his game here, this was the worst move for me. Next, I want to talk about the surprise breakout of the year, and for me, this award goes to Nina Twine from Australian Survivor, simply because I had a very low opinion of her going into the preseason. While I didn't think she was the worst player in the world, I was so worried that because of her connection to Sandra, that they would immediately target her in order to weaken Sandra. But obviously with her not having the same target that Sandra has, that they wouldn't want to keep her around as a meat shield, similar to what they ended up doing with Sandra. But Nina really broke out and really was a good player on her own, where she was able to largely avoid the target on her back due to her connection to Sandra, and was able to build a decent set of allies moving forward. And it's really due to her getting medevac that caused her to be taken out there, as I feel like if that had not happened, that Nina could have made a decently big run on the season. And obviously, while she'll get a second chance on Heroes vs. Villains, I still find myself decently impressed by how she was able to avoid the target that I thought she would have on her back coming into the season based on her connection to Sandra. And I feel like through that she comes out of this with the biggest jump in my estimation from her compared to what I thought of her in the preseason. And on the other hand, we have the Surprise Disappointment Award, a player that I was pretty high on in the preseason, but ultimately dipped on once we saw them actually play. And for me, there were two main contenders for this award, one being Tajan from SA Return of the Outcast, someone I was really excited to see come back after a really long layoff, and we obviously saw him being a pretty big player on his original season, but here on Return of the Outcast, he was largely a disappointment, where yes, he did make it decently far into the season, making it all the way to the final 7, but he was never really that big of a power player, and with him not being that big of a presence in the edit, I found myself pretty underwhelmed by him. But ultimately, I decided to give this award to Shona, who was also on Return of the Outcast, as I did have a similarly high opinion of her coming into the season, and I felt like she would have had a decent amount of connections coming into it, but I felt like she largely underdelivered, where she was not in the best spot during a lot of that season, and I felt like she was largely underedited as well, and that ultimately culminated in her being taken out right at the swap, where she made a very questionable decision by deciding to go to the tribe where her group would be down in numbers. And yes, while you can debate it, as she was sticking with the people that she was closest to in Dino and Phil, it did ultimately culminate in her being taken out, largely after Phil decided to back out of the plan. So while I don't think she played the worst game in the world, I still walk away from the season pretty disappointed in how she ended up doing. Next, I want to talk about the worst player of the year, and this was a pretty fun award, to be honest. Now, admittedly, I didn't really consider anyone from 42 or 43. I mean, I guess an honorable mention would be Geo in that regard, but really, there's really only one contender for this, and that is Tanya from SA Return of the Outcasts. I feel like the way that she played was really bad, where she essentially decided to target Pinty for no real reason, and she even acknowledges at multiple points that she shouldn't be doing this because it's just harming her game. She kept perpetuating this rivalry anyway, and she made it define her entire game. And despite Pinty being far from the best player in the world, her tribe decides to vote her out unanimously at that first tribal, which is really embarrassing. So really, I can't really prop up Tanya too much, and I feel like with the way that she played, both from this season, but also from the potential that she demonstrated from her last season, I feel like to me, she is the worst player of 2022. Next up, we have the most robbed pre-juror of 2022. And for me, there were two main contenders for here. I mean, the honorable mention is Jenny from 42, and I considered her mainly because of how screwed over she was by that first tribal, to where she obviously had a very close relationship with Mike, and had everyone on her tribe gone to vote at that tribal, that she would have outright won that round, and I felt like she could have at least made the merge. Now, I'm not entirely sure if she would have won the season, but considering everything that happened, I felt like the fact that she got screwed over made her a contender for me. But really, the person I decided to give this award to was Palessa from Return of the Outcasts, as I felt like Palessa was playing an okay game up until that last tribal before the merge, and I think she gets unlucky in some regards, where on one hand, she did position herself as playing behind Dante for a lot of it, who was a pretty big figure and someone who was actively targeting Dino and Phil for a lot of it, and while that should have bought her plenty of time by having a bigger target in front of her, it had the effect of making people think that she was actually aligned to Dante and would have stuck with him throughout of it. So because of that, people decided to target Palessa, thinking that would weaken Dante in the long term. But I also think she gets a bit unlucky by the format of that joint tribal, where obviously the two tribes were largely deliberating on their own before tribal, and I felt like a lot of the actual decision was made at tribal once things went live, where I felt like Palessa didn't have too much of an opportunity to really save herself. So I think because of that, I did decide to give her the edge over Jenny, because one, she was closer to actually making the merge, and along with that being a juror, but I also think had she survived that round, she would have had a bit more potential moving forward, whereas someone like Jenny obviously was playing behind Mike for a lot of it, and was obviously much further from actually winning the game considering how early she was taken out. So because of that, I did decide to give this award to Palessa. And on a similar note, I decided to give out an award for most robbed juror, and this was a bit tougher as there were a number of people who I felt like played good games, but did things that contributed to their own downfall. And even the person I decided to go with wasn't the best option in the world, but was someone who I felt like had a decent shot to make it further and potentially win the game. And that person is Steffi, also from SA Return of the Outcasts, as I felt like she played an amazing game throughout a lot of it, really aligning herself in the core of the majority group on her original post-merge tribe, and continued that into the swap as well, where she was able to pick up more allies throughout there. And even in the merge, I felt like she still had a decent amount of control before eventually being blindsided at the final 9. So it was really a case of her having a decent shot to win the game, but ultimately being taken out due to her being a big threat. And finally, I want to give out an award for Player of the Year. And for this, I have a number of honorable mentions. First up, from Big Brother, I do want to mention Kevin Jacobs. I know I didn't include any Big Brother people in this award show, but I still want to acknowledge Kevin's game from BB Can 10. I felt like he played a very impressive winning game where he was in a decent amount of control for a lot of it. And I was still very shocked when Josh actually decided to take him to the end, thinking that he wouldn't be that big of a jury threat, only for Kevin to demolish Josh in a jury vote. So on the whole, I still think Kevin is worthy of mention. As for the Survivor people, I mean, we can talk about some of the winners. So first up, we have Mark Wales from Australian Survivor, where I feel like he played the most dominant game of the year, and I was pretty impressed by his comeback in that regard. But I also think he was greatly benefited by the Blood vs. Water format, which gave him a number of built-in allies. And through the being a Blood vs. Water season, it definitely led to a lot less flips and a lot less dynamic gameplay than I would have liked. So I didn't consider him. There's obviously Marianne from 42, who did play a good game. And I feel like her Omer move at the final 6 really solidified her win there. But again, I feel like before that, she didn't really have too much control, and I felt like her overall position wasn't the best, so I didn't consider her as well. Then we have Mike Gabler, who also played a very interesting game, and definitely a better game than Marianne, but even then, he didn't really dictate too much of the actual votes, and while he did a great job of positioning himself and managing his threat level throughout a lot of the game, I didn't really consider him. And then there were a couple non-winners I considered as well. I considered Omer from 42, as I felt like he played a very impressive game and was definitely the leader of the Taku 4 for a lot of it. And even coming to the merge, he was able to consolidate this majority alliance with a lot of the big threats in the game, people like Lahai and Adrea, for example. But I feel like he definitely struggled later on in the game, as he eventually emerged as the biggest threat on the board. And plus, I'm not entirely sure if he would have won a jury vote even if he got to the end. Now granted, a lot of that is due to Drea turning the jury against him after she was voted out, and that was a less than ideal situation. It was enough to make me want to give the award to someone else. We also have Marianne DeVoice from Return of the Outcast, who also played a very impressive game and obviously got to the final three in a spot to where she wins at the end. I feel like had she won that final immunity, she would have won the game. And even before that, I feel like she positioned herself very well to where she was the smallest threat in the full package, to where people like a Meryl and people like a Steffi were bigger threats than her. But similar to Omer, I feel like she struggled a lot with threat management, to where she got very lucky that Phil went on the immunity run that he did, so that he was always a bigger target ahead of her, to where by the final three, she was essentially the biggest threat left on the board, and she needed to win that final immunity in order to win the game. So I felt like that was enough to leave her out of contention for me. But even then, I was still very impressed by her game that season. And the final honorable mention is Jesse Lopez from Survivor 43, who again played a very dominant game for a lot of it, really controlled a lot of that game, and really did a good job at managing his threat level for a lot of the game, up until the final six, where he does blindside his closest ally in Cody. And while that did make him the biggest threat to win the game for that point, everyone recognized that, to the point where he had a very tough path to getting to the end. So sort of similar to Omer and Marianne, I felt like while he played a very impressive game and would have won had he gotten to the end, he struggled enough with threat management to where I couldn't quite give him the Player of the Year award. But with all that said, the Player of the Year for 2022 for me is Dino Paolo, the winner of Survivor SA Return of the Outcasts. Again, a really fascinating story where he obviously came into his original season, Immunity Island, as a super fan and a student of the game, only for him to really struggle and flame out due to his poor social bonds that eventually result in him being a pre-merge boot, and for him to come in to Return of the Outcast as a pre-merge player and really play a pretty impressive game that where he faced a decent amount of adversity is really impressive to me. Now, yes, it wasn't the most dominant game in the world. There were plenty of rocky roads for him, particularly in that pre-merge where people like a Dante were wanting to gun for him, but he was able to get around that, and from the merge on, plays a pretty impressive game, like really navigating his way to the end game, and he's able to win that final immunity and get himself to the end where he ultimately wins in dominant fashion. It's really a very impressive game for me, more impressive than really any of the other winning games from this season. And yes, while you could say that he struggled with threat management given how people like Dante were wanting to target him, I felt like by the time of the end game, he was in a spot to where he more than likely wins if he gets to the end. And plus, he wasn't even the biggest threat on the board, which increased the chances of him getting to the end and ultimately winning at the end. So it's for all those reasons that I decided to give Dino the Player of the Year award. And with that, that wraps up 2022. And again, this was my first full year of doing this channel, and I was very excited to do this, like following all these seasons, all these various shows, and getting to now recap the year in Survivor. And I'm very excited to see what 2023 brings for us. But there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And again, I have more general Survivor content moving forward, as well as coverage of future seasons as they come up. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.